What's up, peeps? It's Mr. Wicklehouse, and today I'm going to talk to you about the midpoint and the midpoint formula. This is something that you should have seen in algebra or somewhere before, but it's something that we're going to cover in coordinate geometry as well. So let's get started. So what is the midpoint? Well, mid means middle, and point means a point, so it's the point in the middle. So if you've got a line, the midpoint is the one right smack in the middle of the line, and it makes this congruent to this. Okay? You can also think about it as the average of both the x and the y values. Okay, so when we're talking on a coordinate, we're talking about x's and y's or coordinate pairs, and we average those because we have two x's and two y's. Then I can add them together and divide by 2. So that gives me my midpoint formula. So the midpoint formula is x2 plus x1 divided by 2 to get the x value of the midpoint, y2 plus y1 divided by 2 to get the y value of the midpoint. So let's do an example. So given the following point, find the midpoint. Well, here's the x. Let's call that x1. Call this y1. Call this x2 and y2. And we'll plug them in to this formula. Okay, so x2 is 7. Add that to x1, which is 3, and divide by 2 for the x value. y2 is 0. Add that to y1, which is 2. Divide that by 2, and that'll give me the y value. 7 plus 3 is 10. Divided by 2 is 5. 0 plus 2 is 2. Divided by 2 is 1. There is the midpoint of these two endpoints of this line segment. Okay, so that would be the point right in between these two. Alright, now the next one's a little bit more tricky because it causes you to think a little bit differently about this midpoint formula. Alright, these are the two that students tend to have a little bit more trouble with because it's not as straightforward as the first one. We're still going to use the midpoint formula, but instead of actually finding the midpoint, they're giving us the midpoint and they want us to find the other endpoint or the second point on this. So what we have to do is we have to think differently. We have to think about the x value of the midpoint being equal to x2 plus x1 divided by 2. And then the y value of the midpoint is equal to y2 plus y1 divided by 2. Which we know, over here, it's what we said. This is the x value of the midpoint. This is the y value of the midpoint. We're just writing them differently, and we're going to plug these other pieces in here differently. Because I know that this is the x value of the midpoint, and I know that this is the y value of the midpoint. So these values are going to go here. So I'm going to do 4. I'm going to do the x one first. So 4 equals. We'll call this x1 and call this y1. So then I have x2 plus x1, which is 2 divided by 2. Okay. Now I have to do algebra to solve for this other x value, because that's what I'm going to solve for. I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of this 2. That's going to give me 8 equals x2 plus 2. Then I subtract 2, and I get x2 equal to 6. Okay, so now I know the x value of my other endpoint is 6. Now let's do the y. Okay, ym is 5, or the y value of the midpoint is 5. y2 plus y1 is 4 over 2. Okay, multiply both sides by 2. I get 10 equals y2 plus 4. Subtract 4, I get 6 equals y2. That means that the other endpoint that goes with this midpoint is the point 6, 6. That's what I wanted. Okay. Let's do another one. I'm doing the same thing. I'm using these same two pieces from the midpoint formula to find my other endpoint. This is going to be x1 and y1. This is going to be the x value of the midpoint and the y value of the midpoint. I do negative 6 equals x2 plus negative 2 over 2. This other one will be negative 3 equals y2 plus negative 5 over 2. Okay, I've got them set up now. Multiply both sides by 2. I get negative 12 equals x2 plus negative 2. Let's combine this plus minus together and make it just minus, because when I add a negative, it's the same as subtracting. Okay, so then I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and I'm going to get negative 10 equals x2. And I got my x value of my point. I'm going to multiply by 2 on this other one. I get negative 6 equals y2. Adding a negative, remember, means to subtract. That means I'm going to add 5 to both sides. And I'm going to get negative 1 equals y2. So, the other endpoint is negative 10, negative 1. Okay? Those are the two types of problems that you're going to see in here. That's the algebra part of it. You should be able to know how to find these points on the coordinate plane, or vice versa. If they give you a picture of points on the coordinate plane, then you should be able to identify what those are. If you have trouble doing that, then come talk to me and I'll help you out with that. Alright? That's all there is to it. I'll talk to you later.